Christian is a author of 11 books on Rhode Island, the American Revolution, and editor and publisher of the Rhode Island history blog, Small State, Big History. Thanks, Christian.
All right, well, thank you for being here and listening to my two favorite topics. First is the Battle of Rhode Island. And as Craig said, I do have copies of my book, which is the authoritative book on the Battle of Rhode Island, if you're interested. Portsmouth obviously played a big role. And also the causes of the American Revolution. I mean, it's 250th anniversary, and you guys are out there wanting to find out, so that's great. I will say, this is my longest lecture, so hang in there. It's hard because you also watched that very good documentary. So that was a lot of work that Michelle and Bill and others put in. All right. On August, and if you could all silence your cell phones too. That's on August 31st, 1774, that's before the revolution started, British troops marched to Charleston just outside of Boston. Do I have a clicker? I don't have my clicker. I might have lost it. But if you can just stand there and I can just... No, it's a little bit... If someone could just stand there and I can just nod. Yeah. I don't think I'm sorry. I might have put it somewhere.
Just advance it that way.
Yeah. So the British troops marched to Charleston outside of Boston, seized gunpowder from an arsenal. The next day, a false rumor spread that during this operation, British soldiers killed 6 Massachusetts men. The news spread like wildfire. In short time, some 18,000 militiamen from all over New England were on the march for Boston. However, they soon received information that news of the killings was false. The militiamen returned to their homes. Can you forward? Just press the side or down button. No, you've gone too far. One more. That's it. Just go, try to go one at a time without hitting it too hard. Still 2 days later, about 1,000 militiamen from towns around Boston converged on Cambridge. The militiamen terrorized several Tories and forced them to resign their posts. Another Tory barely saved himself by riding helter-skelter to Boston. Finally, Samuel Adams arrived at Cambridge to calm the militiamen down and asked them to disperse and go home. In Newport, Ezra Stiles gushed, "New Englanders are ready to fight for their liberties." This was an extraordinary reaction by the militiamen. These were not patriots who had been fighting against British regulars in Boston. We've all heard about that. These were ordinary farmers, yet they picked up their muskets, left their homes, and marched for dozens of miles, ready to do battle with some of the best troops in the world. How did it come to this? What led Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the other 13 colonies to declare their independence 250 years ago? For many, it made no sense. Americans cherished their liberty, so did England. White Americans were probably the freest people and had the highest average income in the world. In 1763, Great Britain and the 13 colonies had emerged victorious in the 7 Years' War against France, known as the French and Indian War. Americans were ecstatic. France had been kicked out of Canada. France's Indian allies had been temporarily subdued. Americans were proud to be English. No one anticipated that in just 13 years, the 13 colonies would permanently break from Britain. If you had to summarize the reason for the rebellion in one phrase, it would be no taxation without representation. That's a real thing. As a result of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain found itself deeply in debt. The Crown needed to increase taxes on the 13 colonies. The Crown also needed tax revenues to fund soldiers stationed at the frontier. The 13 colonies needed to pay their fair share, just as taxpayers in Great Britain were already doing and more. That sounds fair. But American patriots resisted the efforts to tax them, mainly on the ground that they were not represented in Parliament. Was that all there was to the American Revolution? I hope by the end of this lecture you say no. When looking at the causes of historical events, it's important to consider what participants wrote about and what they did, But it's also important to consider deeper underlying causes that were not necessarily openly discussed, but that help explain what happened. These are the preconditions that make big changes possible. I'm going to emphasize those today. Britain and the 13 colonies had many things in common, as I said, such as the English language, a deep respect for rights and the rule of law, but there were some crucial differences that led to tensions between them. It made a rebellion easier to contemplate and to implement. I begin with how different society in the third quarter of the 18th century was organized in Britain as compared to the 13 colonies. Now, British society was organized like a pyramid. At the top, the British monarchy, the king and queen. Britain's kings at this time didn't have absolute power. Their powers were limited by the Britain's Glorious Revolution of 1688. Parliament enacted the tax bills, including the laws, including the tax laws. But the crown still exercised significant influence. King George III had to assent to bills passed by Parliament before they could become law. He would hire and fire prime ministers. The prime minister's cabinet ran the British administration and military. And of course, the decision of who would become king was based on hereditary, royal family birth. The next level in the pyramid is aristocracy. They were perhaps 4% of the British population. These were earls, dukes, duchesses, lords, marquises, barons, baronesses, and the like. Strict rules of primogeniture and entail meant that normally the eldest son received the bulk of the family's ancient estate. British aristocrats in the 18th century dominated the wealth in the countryside during a time when most Britons worked on rural farms. Aristocrats owned huge estates that were worked on mostly by tenant farmers who didn't own their land but worked on it for their livelihoods. An aristocrat might have thousands of tenant farmers, sometimes even 10,000. Aristocrats often dominated a local village, employing their villagers to build their great houses, to be their household servants, and to maintain their vast estates. Think of Downton Abbey. Aristocrats built influence by using patronage, getting their allies placed in key government posts. And of course, they dominated the House of Lords, and any legislation to pass Parliament had to pass the House of Lords. Next in the pyramid are country gentlemen and gentlewomen. They were mainly the country gentry. They didn't soil their hands by working the land themselves. A few might have the title of Sir before their names or Esquire after their names. Some were merchants or lawyers or clerics. Being a gentleman or a gentlewoman was a real crucial distinction in 18th century Britain. Their behavior was marked by birth into the right families, displaying good manners, being well educated, well spoken, and well dressed. They set themselves apart and above the masses of the people who were expected to defer to them and recognize their superior status. So if I was a country gentry, you might have to bow to me every time you saw me. So that doesn't sound very American, does it? Next in the pyramid was a large group of independent, ordinary people. They were farmers who worked on the land they owned. The successful ones were called yeomen. They were also small independent business owners such as blacksmiths and shopkeepers. Following them in the pyramid is another large group, tenant farmers, domestic servants, and other dependent people. They didn't own their own land, houses, or businesses, and they were paid for their labor mainly by aristocrats or the country gentry. There was little social mobility in England. You were born to your station in life. Here's some great drawings that I found in an antique shop, and I bought them for $8 each, I think. The first guy is a member of the British aristocracy, Venison and Claret, that's his name. And the middle guy is the fortunate macaroni. So you know Yankee Doodle, macaroni, stick a feather in his hat and call him macaroni. Well, this is the fanciest dude in 18th century England right there. On the right is more of a country gentry, not highbrow aristocrat. He's called roast beef and pork. So America, by comparison, was organized on a much flatter scale. America was much more egalitarian. It had no royalty. Here's King George III. The first member of royalty who came to America was 1780, the king's son. America also lacked an aristocracy. Some wealthy elites in Virginia, South Carolina, and even in the North tried to imitate English aristocrats, but they were never as wealthy as aristocrats in England. Charles Carroll of Carrollton in Maryland earned an estimated £1,800 a year, probably the most in the colonies. By comparison, in England, the Earl of Derby's vast estates worked on by tenants brought in an annual income of £40,000 per year. George Washington's farms were thought to be netting in the 1770s about £300 per year. Wow, a lot less. According to an English visitor, this put Washington, quote, only to the better rank of yeoman in England. Major merchants in North American cities like Newport had a net worth of from £25,000 to £50,000. In contrast, merchants in London, Liverpool, and Bristol were worth from £200,000 to £800,000. Thomas Hancock raised John Hancock. He was the wealthiest merchant in New England, colonial New England. He had one of the largest houses in Boston, but like almost all houses in the colonies, it had just 8 rooms. By comparison, the Sackville family's palace, Knoll in Kent, had 365 rooms. 1 room for each day of the year. So, William Byrd was one of the wealthiest Virginia tobacco planters. He had a 65-foot long brick house, and having a brick house was a real sign of wealth. Nobody in Newport had a brick house in colonial times. The Marquis of Rockingham's house at Wentworth Woodhouse in England was almost 10 times longer than Byrd's house. So you can tell that here, Wentworth Woodhouse, Yorkshire, England, you can't even see where it starts and ends. And Westover, one of the larger colonial plantations, maybe the longest, much smaller. Comparing the size and value of a British great house, on the right, the Roland Robinson House, beautiful house in Saunderstown, Narragansett, wealthy Narragansett planter, but compared to England, he was not that wealthy. Look at how someone wealthy in England at that time what kind of house they would have. And the interior, Drayton Hall in South Carolina had a very wealthy slave society for the richest, but relatively plain interior. Look at how gaudy the interior than the British aristocrat house is. Charles Chauncey of Massachusetts stated in 1766, there's scarce a man in the colonies, certainly there's not in New England, that would be deemed worthy of being called a rich man in Great Britain. Land in America was cheap, while it was expensive in Britain. 2/3 of the colonial white population in the 13 colonies owned land, compared to 1/5 of the population in Britain. That's a huge difference. The system of tenantry, so important in England, never took hold in America. White indentured servants were brought over from Britain, but they often ran away or completed their terms and purchased their own land or squatted on land. A North Carolina man advised an English investor that land could not be rented in North Carolina because tenant farming just didn't work. Land ownership was crucial. Landowners were economically independent, not beholden to any aristocrat or country gentry. In the 13 colonies, land ownership meant the ability to vote. Approximately 2/3 of Rhode Island's white men could vote. This was among the highest voting rates in the world, maybe the highest. Widespread land ownership also meant that there was not widespread poverty in the 13 colonies. It was a very middling society. By comparison, Britain had huge populations of landless poor in the countryside and urban poor in the cities. Without an aristocracy and a mass of destitute, landless people in England, Americans were more like each other economically. A British visitor complained that the idea of equality seems to be generally to prevail, and the inferior order of the people pay but little external respect to those who occupy a superior station. In America, social distinctions and hierarchy were just less important than in England. John Adams in 1761, writing in Massachusetts, observed that everyone fancied themselves a yeoman, even laborers who never owned an inch of ground in their lives. Consider the background of some of the most famous revolutionaries. They succeeded not because of their birth or aristocratic connections, but because of their merit. Ben Franklin started wearing an apron as a printer, getting his hands dirty every day with ink. Only after retiring from the printing business in 1747 did Franklin become an enlightened philosopher, inventor, and gentleman. The two top generals in the American War were George Washington and Rhode Island's Nathaniel Greene. They never attended college. John Adams attended Harvard College, but his father had just been an above-average middling farmer and a cordwainer. Here's a nice comparison of Frederick Lord North, 2nd Earl of Guilford, in ermine robes. He was one of the main prime ministers opposing American independence. And on the right, we have Paul Revere, beautiful portrait by Jonathan Copley out of Boston. He's a working man. He's a tradesman, and he's proud of it, and he's holding a silversmith. He was probably the top silversmith in the 13 colonies. Another important difference between Britain and America was that Britain had an established church, the Church of England. British taxpayers were obligated to pay to support the church. That's what an established church is. The Church of England had its hierarchical order of bishops and deans and archdeacons and priests. The Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, helped their parishioners become attached to the king and queen. At every service, Anglican priests said a prayer to King George III. That got them in trouble once the Revolutionary War started. There was no established church in the 13 colonies, no single one. Instead, there was a hodgepodge of numerous religious sects with no hierarchy. England had its dissenters, but if England had 30, America had hundreds. Avoiding an established church was probably the most important religious issue religious practitioners in America cared about in the founding era. Rhode Island, famously, was a tolerant colony that had all different kinds of Protestant sects, from Congregationalists to several Baptist sects, Quakers, Anglicans, even Moravians. Newport also had a Jewish congregation, and it was much the same in most of the colonies. In the South, Virginia had an established church, the Anglican Church, but significant inroads were made by New Light Presbyterians, separate Baptists, and then Methodists. Immigrants brought their own religions, German Lutherans, French Huguenots, Dutch Reformists, and the like. Catholics were allowed to practice their religion in Maryland, the only colony they were allowed to do so officially. This is really how toleration spread as a policy in the 13 colonies. There were simply too many different sects for a single religion to control all the others and become an established church. Taking stock of all these social, economic, and religious differences by the 1770s, America was becoming less British and more American. All right, let's change topics. Let's get into the details of what it meant for the 13 colonies to be exactly that, colonies. Britain was the parent country. Under the thinking of the day, the parent country was expected to exploit its colonies for its own economic benefit. Of course, Americans resented being exploited as colonists. Economically, America was doing great and had a promising future. In America, wages were high, land was cheap, and taxes were low. American farmers were amazingly productive, exporting food not only to the Caribbean, but to Britain itself. America just needed free trade and free markets to really take off. Consider some of the types of laws that Britain imposed on the 13 colonies. First, American exports to Britain had to be carried on British ships with majority British crews. So you had, products here in Newport, to go to Britain, they had to have majority British crews. Some products had to be shipped to England, including tobacco from Virginia and rice and indigo from South Carolina, the two most valuable products in the 13 colonies. To trade their crops to mainland European countries, the crops had to be carried on the British ships to Britain. Then you had to pay to have a new ship, a new crew, new insurance, to send it to a European country. And Southern planters considered these requirements already a hidden tax. Second, Britain wanted to make America a captive market for its manufactured goods. In short, Americans were to provide Britain with the raw materials. Britain would then turn around and manufacture those into new products to sell to Americans at an enhanced profit. For example, Americans were prohibited from exporting manufactured woolen products, such as hats. Instead, Americans were to export raw materials to Britain, such as beaver pelts, wool, and pig iron. Britain would then manufacture the products and export them to America. George Washington in the 1770s found a new source of revenue by catching huge amounts of shad and herring from fish spring runs on the Potomac River. I think in the Narrow River, they used to have the same thing. He had the fish salted and cured in barrels for export to the British Caribbean. He discovered that the best and cheapest salt for curing fish came from Spain, but British imperial policy forced him to buy inferior and more expensive salt from England. American merchants were restricted by the Molasses Act of 1733. Its goal was for Americans to purchase sugar and molasses, which was vital for the production of rum, from British Caribbean possessions such as Jamaica and Barbados. The law did this by imposing heavy taxes on these goods when they were imported from foreign territories like French Caribbean islands or Dutch Caribbean islands. Rhode Island merchants who sought molasses to distill into rum in Newport and Providence discovered that molasses from France's Caribbean colonies was much cheaper than British molasses. Thus, Rhode Island and American merchants frequently bought French molasses and evaded paying taxes. But after 1765, British revenues and custom officials began cracking down on customs violations. This increased tensions. For example, Nathaniel Greene of Coventry was at first a neutral when it came to the dispute between Britain and 13 colonies. But then it changed when one of his ships that he owned was seized by British officer naval William Duddingston in February 1772, and his captain was roughly treated. By 1774, Greene was a founding member of East Greenwich's Kentish Guards. Americans saw how the government treated the colony of Ireland. By virtue of harsh laws to subjugate the Irish Catholic population, most Irish Catholics lived their lives of abject poverty. They were illiterate and they were unskilled. By 1770, virtually none owned land. Most all were poor tenant farmers. The descendants of Scotch-Irish Protestant settlers did not thrive in Ireland either. They tended to be dissenters from the Church of England, so they were discriminated against too, though not nearly as much as the Catholics were. Still, from the middle of the 18th century onward, more than 100,000 Scotch-Irish migrated to America. While Americans recognized that Britain treated the 13 colonies better than Ireland, they feared that the British government any time could turn and start treating Americans like they did Ireland. Many American immigrants and poor farmers dreamed of owning their own land. They were willing to move to the west to settle the land, even if that meant pushing out Indians who owned the land. The British government tried to restrict American settlers from settling beyond the proclamation line of 1763. Britain was concerned that Americans settling beyond the Appalachian Mountains would lead to more conflicts and wars with Indian nations, and a war would require Britain to spend more money, have more soldiers. This is exactly what happened with Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, one of the most effective Indian uprisings in North American history. This proclamation line of 1763 frustrated Americans and immigrants who wanted to settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains to buy cheap land or take land from Indians. Here you have Daniel Boone and a Cherokee warrior. What else would a mother country do to exploit a colony? Why, send it convicts. British annually sent convicts to their 13 colonies, mostly to Maryland and Virginia. An estimated 50,000 British and Irish convicts against their wills were shipped to America between 1718 and 1775. They were typically bound over as indentured servants for 7 to 14 years. No colony wanted them. They had been convicted of crimes, sometimes serious ones. Other times they were convicted of stealing bread to feed their families. They were sentenced to, quote, transportation out of Britain to the 13 colonies. The colonies tried to ban them by taxing them on their arrival, but London would not allow it. Ben Franklin said that in return, the 13 colonies should send rattlesnakes to Britain. After America won its independence and Britain could no longer transport its convicts to America, Britain eventually found a new colony to which to transport them to Australia. I love this sign in England, Dorset. Any person willfully injuring any part of this county bridge will be guilty of felony and upon conviction liable to be transported for life. So be careful if you ever endorse it. Britain also restricted the monetary supply of 13 colonies, thus holding back their economic growth. These days, monetary policy is a big deal. They didn't really understand it then, but there was very little money circulated in those days. Britain was the one who had the money, and they wanted all the gold to be sent to Britain. So there wasn't enough gold in America. You had to pay taxes in gold. And then Parliament also issued a law disallowing issuances of paper money, which Rhode Island liked to do, issue paper money. Some historians believe that the Currency Act upset colonists more than any other act other than the Stamp Act. Another source of tension between the 13 colonies and the mother country was a surprising one. This was efforts by patriots of the 13 colonies in the 1760s and 1770s to limit the African slave trade that were quashed by London. In colonial times, all of the 13 colonies had enslaved people, most of them descendants of African captives. Of the 500,000 black people in 1775, about 450,000 lived in the South. About 50,000 resided in the North, in all the colonies. Most all enslaved. Rhode Island had the highest percentage of black people in New England, about 6%. In North America, Newport sent the most slave ships to Africa. Overall, North America was a small player in the African slave trade, but among the 13 colonies, Rhode Island sponsored the most slave voyages. Still, at the time, Great Britain was by far the world's leading slave trading country. African captives were needed, some 30,000 each year, to replace the enslaved workers who died laboring on the horrific sugar plantations, in Jamaica, Barbados, and other British possessions in the Caribbean. These plantations grew sugar cane from which sugar and molasses were produced. These were by far the most valuable products produced in all of the British Empire. In the build-up to the American Revolution, patriots began to recognize the great contradiction. They were clamoring for liberty and preservation of their rights from the British Crown, yet colonists were actually enslaving people. Here's Abigail Adams to John Adams in 1774. I wish most sincerely there was not a slave in the province. It's always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me. Fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. You know my mind upon this subject. This new attitude gave rise to an abolition movement in the North, the Western world's first one. It started in Massachusetts, continued in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and was felt in all the 13 colonies. Pennsylvania established the world's first abolition society in 1775, and in 1780 enacted legislation that gradually eliminated slavery in the state. Here are two pamphlets in the Library of Congress by Massachusetts authors, anti-slavery tracts. The topic of the abolition movement in the North is too big for me to discuss at length. I have another whole lecture on it. But I will discuss efforts by colonies to limit the import of African captives into the colonies, which efforts were resisted by Crown authorities. Excuse me. A bill prohibiting the importation of African captives into Massachusetts passed the Massachusetts legislature in 1771 and in 1773, but neither was assented to by the royal governor. Royal governors had instructions from London not to allow any laws that might threaten the profits of slavery and the slave trade in the British Caribbean islands. Almost every one of the 13 colonies tried to limit the importation of African captives by increasing taxes on them, on the importation of them, tariffs. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses tried this approach several times, but each time the royal governor vetoed the bills. Thomas Jefferson even wrote about this in his first draft of the Declaration of Independence. King George III, Jefferson railed, has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain an execrable commerce. Jefferson meant that the king's policy was for his royal governors not to assent to any law that limited the African slave trade. This part was thrown out of the Declaration of Independence, and rightfully so, given the hypocrisy of Jefferson and other American slave owners, but it does indicate frustration about these legislative vetoes. And here's a Rhode Island bill an act prohibiting the importation of Negroes into this colony. It did pass in 1774, so it's one of the first abolitionist legislative bills in the world, actually. And it passed because Rhode Island didn't have a royal governor. It's one of the royal free colonies like Connecticut. Let's move to the topic of demographics. Americans wondered why they were being exploited and restricted by Britain when their future seemed so bright. The 13 colonies' population was growing exponentially. The North American white population was growing more than any place in the Western world. It grew from 1 million in 1750 to 2 million in 1770. Another doubling occurred 20 years later. Ben Franklin estimated that Americans' population would eventually outstrip that of Britain herself. Wow. Much of the population growth was from natural births and large families, but immigration was a key factor too. Between 1764 and 1776, some 125,000 people left the British Isles for America. More than 100,000 German immigrants from the Rhine Valley immigrated to America. They were crammed on crowded ships that typically landed in Philadelphia. Increasing population meant increasing economic strength. American farmers were creating surpluses, whether on small and middling farms in New England or the Middle Colonies, or on plantations labored on by people in the South. Did America even need Britain to succeed economically? In addition, the literacy rates among North America white colonists were probably the highest in the world. It's estimated that around 70% of white colonists could read and write. In New England, the literacy rate was 85%. A little lower in Rhode Island because they didn't have a public school system, unfortunately. By comparison, the literacy rate in Britain was about 40% and France 29%. 100,000 copies of Common Sense was sold. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, supporting American independence, railing against the king. It appeared that the 13 colonies were strong enough to run their own colonies as a separate country, not beholden to a parent country. One of the most valued traditions of the 13 colonies was their legislatures. Since the 17th century and up to 1763, each of the 13 colonies had a legislature enacting laws. The laws were typically not vetoed by the royal governor or by officials in London. This British policy was known as salutary neglect. London allowed great freedom to colonial legislatures, and many colonists were landowners and therefore could vote. They greatly valued the right to elect representatives to their legislatures. The legislatures, in turn, kept taxes low and regulations light, just like the colonists desired. When, after 1763, Parliament began to enact laws imposing taxes on colonists complained that Parliament was taxing them without their being represented in Parliament. Thus, the colonists argued the taxes were invalid. Parliament, of course, met in London, England. This was more than 3,000 miles away from the 13 colonies. It often took between 1 and 2 months for a ship to sail between London and the 13 colonies. Thus, it wasn't really practical for Americans to serve in Parliament. British intellectuals argued that Americans were represented under the doctrine of virtual representation. Under this doctrine, every member of Parliament represented all British subjects in Britain and in their colonies. Americans rejected this argument. They were close to their representatives. Often an American voter knew who his representative was personally. Americans looked at the electoral system for Parliament and saw corruption. Half a dozen cities in England had no one representing them in Parliament, including Manchester and Birmingham. Then there were rotten boroughs, tiny districts which aristocrats used their money to buy influence with few voters there. The most infamous one was Old Sarum, which had less than 10 voters. Here's a picture of Old Sarum. 5 other rotten boroughs had less than 50 voters voting for a seat in Parliament. There were dozens of pocket boroughs where aristocratic family owned the houses of more than 50% of the voters. Some boroughs were actually controlled by the crown. Americans thought all this was madness. Reform in England didn't happen until 1832. All right, I think I've established that the 13 colonies had some serious differences with Britain that gave rise to a number of grievances. What made ordinary patriots take up arms and try to win their independence from Britain on the battlefield? The answer in part lies in understanding how many Americans viewed their world. It turned out that Americans began to see the world through the lens of dissenters writing in England in the early 18th century. The most influential of these was John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. They relied on John Locke's natural rights and social contract theories. Each man possessed the natural rights of life, liberty, and property, which governments must not invade. Government had to be watched continually with the utmost vigilance. Otherwise, unchecked governmental power would destroy the rights of the individual, take away their property. Trenchard and Gordon particularly warned about corruption in British politics and denounced the propensity for tyranny of the British ministry of the day. And this message found a receptive audience in Britain in the opposition party, known as the Country Party, later called Whigs, and the dominant party were the Tories, supported by the king and aristocratic rule in the Anglican Church. Trenchard and Gordon's message also found a wide audience in the 13 colonies. Colonists began to view the missteps of British policy after 1763 not as well-intentioned mistakes, but as evidence of a deliberate plot to subvert the colonists' liberty. Crucial to this Whig approach was the virtue of a landowning people. Landowners were not subject to corrupt influences of the powerful. Independent landowners and business owners were free to make their own decisions without the influence of their social superiors. Whigs saw a perfect balance between the monarch, the lords, the aristocrats, and the parliament. They were on their guard for anything that would usurp the rights of parliament, the representatives of the people. The king and aristocrats, acting through British ministers and their administrators, relied in part on patronage to develop their support, and Whigs saw the use of patronage giving jobs to allies as corrupt, a way to undermine the power of parliament. The response of a free people to increasing government tyranny was to rebel. This was necessary to cleanse the policy of corruption. Rebellion was therefore a virtuous act. The Americans' fear of corruption led them to see a conspiracy against liberty in British policies after 1763, leading them to take up arms. Consider what Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island wrote in a pamphlet in 1764. British subjects are to be governed agreeable to laws which they themselves have consented, and are not to be compelled to part with their property, but as it is called for by the authority of such laws. Anything less amounts to the miserable condition of slaves. So they always talking about slavery of white people, they were ignoring the black people who were actually enslaved. There's Stephen Hopkins. Actually, that's a cousin. They never had an image of him, so they took it of a cousin. So. All patriots spoke in a similar way, fear of being enslaved by the British. The American Revolution at its start was not forward-thinking, tried to build a new government and society, not at first. Instead, it was backward-looking. Patriots sought to restore the concept of a balanced government and to preserve the rights of freemen. Americans rose up to demand the rights they felt they deserved as British subjects. In this way, they were being more English than the English. The Whig conspiracy ideology did have some grounding in reality. The British government, after decades of leaving Americans alone, after 1763, tried to assert increasing control over the 13 colonies and to increase taxation on the colonists. The Sugar Act of 1764 actually reduced the tax rate on molasses. Parliament thought that by reducing the taxes, there'd be more compliance by the merchants. But that's not the way it worked out. John Hancock of Boston, John Brown of Providence, they wanted to continue trading with the French. But because the tax was imposed on foreign trade, the tax itself wasn't seen as a big threat. The Stamp Act was a different deal. The Stamp Act, enacted by Parliament in 1765, required colonists to pay a hefty tax on numerous uses of paper, such as writing paper, wills, court documents, newspapers, diplomas, even playing cards. This tax was strongly opposed by American Whigs, taxation without representation. And I recently learned that, except possibly for Georgia, not a single penny of stamp tax was ever paid by any colony.
Can you repeat that?
Not a single cent of stamp tax was ever paid by a colony. That's how much they opposed it. Pretty amazing. The Stamp Act was repealed by Parliament in 1766. The Townshend Acts were introduced in 1767 and 1768, imposed new taxes on tea, glass, paint, and lead. Towns in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut proposed to boycott the importation of British goods. Oh, if you can go back one. You can see tar and feathering was sometimes done. I don't believe it was ever done in Rhode Island. Under these new trade laws, more full-time custom officers were hired, receiving a salary from London instead of the colonial governments to ensure they remained loyal to Britain. Officers were incentivized with bonuses when smugglers were caught. There were a lot of smugglers out there. The Royal Navy was ordered to help with customs enforcement. Vice Admiralty courts were expanded, allowing the British to try smuggling cases without a jury rather than having cases heard by a jury of peers. The violent struggle for independence arguably began with the Gaspee Affair in 1772. On the night of June 9-10, 1772, patriots from Providence attacked the Royal Navy revenue schooner Gaspee, which had run aground off Namquit Point in Warwick. Here we have a picture of Sabin's Tavern, which doesn't exist anymore. It was on South Street. And Abraham Whipple was one of the leaders of the raid. He was also later a Continental Navy captain. The Gaspee and her commander had been much reviled by coastal traders for too rigorously and unfairly enforcing the revenue laws. Rhode Island merchants and seamen had complained of illegal abuses committed by Lieutenant William Duddingston, but the Royal Navy ignored them. Rhode Islanders felt they had to resort to extra legal means. When word of the Gaspee's grounding reached Providence, a group of merchants led by John Brown and one of his sea captains, Abraham Whipple, met at Thomas Sabin's Tavern on the Providence waterfront and plotted the destruction of the Gaspee. Taking 8 longboats, the raiders arrived at the still standing Gaspee, accompanied by another boat from Bristol, and quickly boarded the ship. In the ensuing scuffle, the Gaspee's commander, Lieutenant William Duddingston, was shot and wounded in the groin. He did survive and became an admiral. After removing all of the 19 British officers and sailors, including Duddingston, the ship was burned to the waterline. You can see some, go back one. You can see some examples of that in art. Over the next year, the British Crown sought to bring the perpetrators to justice, and King George III talked to treason being committed, and that meant being hanged, potentially. A royal commission was convened in Newport and authorized to send all suspects to Britain for trial. This seemed to fulfill earlier British threats to bypass regular judicial procedures. It provoked Virginia to call for the creation of intercolonial committees of correspondence, to which 5 assemblies responded. However, royal commissioners in Newport failed to apprehend or charge anyone. The burning of the Gaspee was the first significant violent act of defiance leading up to the outbreak of the war at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. In the spring of 1773, the Townshend Acts were repealed, except that a tax on tea remained. The Tea Act helped the East India Company, a crown monopoly in India that faced financial difficulties, had a huge inventory of unsold tea, and had bribed members of Parliament. Even though the Act lowered taxes on tea, patriots still opposed it on the principle. If Parliament was allowed to impose a small tax on colonists, it could later impose a much larger one. Because women were associated with socializing over cups of tea, they took the lead in opposing the Tea Act. An affluent Newport woman was said to have decided, quote, to have no India tea drank in her family until the tax was removed. Eventually, 50 to 300 Newport families, the numbers vary, were described as no longer using the, quote, noxious weed. Now, in Boston Harbor, on December 16, 1773, Boston patriots, many wearing disguises as Narragansett Indians, not Mohawks, we have an article on that in Small State, Big History, boarded 3 ships and threw 342 chests of tea owned by the East India Company into the water. What really started the Revolutionary War was not the Boston Tea Party, it was the harsh British response to the Boston Tea Party. Parliament first enacted the Boston Port Bill on March 31, 1774, closing Boston Harbor until Boston paid for the destroyed tea. In Newport, Ezra Stiles wrote that News of the Boston Port Bill caused amazing alarm. Parliament next enacted the Massachusetts Government Act. It terminated the Massachusetts Charter of 1691, bringing the colony under control of the British government. That was a big deal. The military governor, General Thomas Gage, became governor of Massachusetts, a military governor. He was also the commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America. The Massachusetts Government Act was sweeping. All judges, justices of the peace, sheriffs, and other courts officers would be appointed by the governor, and they served at his pleasure. Members of the council, which is the upper house, kind of like the Senate, had usually been appointed by the lower house members and members of the upper house who were leaving, but now they were going to be selected by the crown. Other than annual meetings to elect town officers and members of the lower house, no town meeting in Massachusetts could be held without the consent of the governor. That was a stunner. All members of juries would be appointed by the sheriff, and of course the sheriff was appointed by the governor. These acts deeply upset many in Massachusetts, especially the numerous ordinary farmers. And you remember when I started this lecture about the farmers turned militiamen. They were used to controlling their own towns through their town meetings and having some influence on the appointment of judges and sheriffs and court officers. Now the royal governor was appointing local judges and paid them with funds from Britain. Farmers in Massachusetts began interfering with court proceedings, preventing them from operating. When asked after the war why he fought at Lexington and Concord, Levi Preston said he did not pay any stamp tax or tea tax, and he did not know who John Locke was. Instead, he responded, "We always had governed ourselves, and we always meant to." Parliament had miscalculated. Rather than cowing Massachusetts and separating it from the other colonies rallied to Massachusetts' side. This was totally unexpected in London. The coercive acts, as they were known, became the justification for convening the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in late 1774. Thus, the two most rebellious colonies, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, would not be alone. So 40 words to summarize what I've just said. Americans are feeling more American, less British. Americans resent being exploited by the parent country and treated as colonists. And Americans deeply want to govern themselves and oppose any interference with their traditional self-government. No taxation without representation is a big deal, and the Massachusetts Government Act was a real threat. Congress voted to become independent of Britain on July when? July what? 2nd. Good, I heard that. Not July 4th. They voted on July 2nd to become independent, and Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. Most of the Declaration was devoted to the reasons why the former 13 colonies sought their independence, many of which I've discussed today. After the reading of the Declaration of Independence in New York City, a crowd went down to Lower Manhattan in the Battery Park and tore down a statue of George III. It was melted down into 40,000 musket balls. The Declaration's preamble was more aspirational. It included what the great historian Gordon Wood has called the 5 most important words in American history: all men are created equal. Americans wanted something more than independence from Great Britain. They wanted to establish a new state governments based on democracy, equality, and republicanism. It would be a political system underpinned by the sovereignty of the people. The people at this time were white men who owned property. This was still a revolutionary concept in world history, that sovereignty lay with the people and not a monarch or group of elites. Within 25 years in America, by the early 1800s, the people meant all white men, even if they owned no property. That was another revolutionary development. Of course, the great inconsistency of the Revolutionary era was the existence of slavery. It took another 75 years and a civil war to extinguish it and reframe and expand who the people were included. Women were granted the rights to vote in 1920, and we're still working today on who is included in the term the people. Professor Gordon Wood, and I have an article on Professor Gordon Wood on My Small State, Big History that I hope you guys can read. I took classes from him in Brown University, so I have some fun stories. He has emphasized that our nation does not have a dominant ethnic group. Instead, we are a nation of immigrants. He said recently, since now the whole world is in the United States, nothing but the ideals coming out of the revolution can turn such an assortment of different individuals into one people that the Declaration says we are. To be an American is not to be someone, from some country, but to believe in something. That is why the 250th anniversary of the Declaration is so important. Most of the delegates of the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia on August 2nd, 1776, including Rhode Island's two founders, Stephen Hopkins and William Ellery. Hopkins suffered from palsy, and he reportedly remarked as he steadied his right hand with his left, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." William Ellery reportedly said of the event, "I was determined to see how they all looked as they signed what might be their death warrant. Undaunted resolution was displayed in every countenance." Thank you. I know it's been a while, but if anyone would like to ask a question, I'd be glad to try it out.
Christian, thank you. Latest estimate for the release of the book, Rhode Island in the American Revolution.
Well, there's a book of Rhode Island, the American Revolution. It's a compilation of many of our small state, big history articles on the American Revolution, probably in the late fall.
Late fall.
Yeah, and I also have another book coming out on the Rhode Island Black Regiment, soldiers of color in that regiment, and that's like a major book, taking a lot of time, but I'm hoping that'll come out in November.
Sir, could you explain a little bit more when you talked about the resistance of the colonies toward the continuation of the importation of slaves and the Crown kept overruling them? You mentioned abolitionism, but that wasn't widespread throughout all the colonies. What was their main reason why they resisted? In what way was it negative to them?
To who, the Americans?
Yeah.
Oh,
why
yeah.
the Americans
Well, why did they, so the question is, why were the Americans, all the colonies tried to restrict
Right.
importation of African captives. Some had different motivations. The North is more humanitarian. In the South, you do have a little bit of that. George Mason, Thomas Jefferson opposed it on that ground. But there's also, they didn't need any more enslaved people in Virginia. They already had too many. They were changing from a tobacco to a wheat economy, and they already had too many, so that they had more, it would reduce the value of their enslaved people they had. So, but, at least it was an effort to end the slave trade, but didn't succeed, at least under Britain.
But the DeWolf family was one of the largest participants in that. They had a different agenda.
The Wolf family you're talking about, there was only one DeWolf slave voyage before the Revolutionary War. Almost all of their voyages were after the Revolutionary War. To me, those Rhode Islanders who participated in the slave trade after the Revolutionary War are even worse than the ones before. Afterwards, we had the Revolution, we had talked about equality, we talked about all men being equal, and then you have participating in the awful slave trade. So, but that was after the Revolutionary War. Oh, can you go one more? That's it? Oh, I got the wrong one. But I'm happy to have got this Rhode Island campaign book about the Battle of Rhode Island and some other Revolutionary War books here if you're interested. So thank you very much. $20 each. So.